All right, so I am standing between y'all and beer, so I get it. We'll see who trickles in during this, and we'll try to keep this fun. I'm looking forward to, I'm actually very grateful to be here today. I came from a couple other conferences, very government-oriented, and it's nice to be among peers again and talk about the good, bad, and the ugly of developing capabilities and trying to balance that with corporate interests. I've had some really enlightening talks here, so it's great to meet all of you, and if I haven't had a chance to meet you, I'd love to meet you after this. I do have to be honest with you, there's a cover charge for this talk, and I think you guys can meet this cover charge. Shouldn't be a problem. Only two things are required. You come to this talk without any company loyalty, and you bring no I started with emotion. That's impossible, and I actually don't want to suppress emotion. That would be unnatural. But I do want to curb our biases, and I don't think that's a problem with this group, especially with a lot of the conversations I've had. Open source everybody does a really good job of changing their hats out and remembering that when you're developing in the open source, maybe the interests of the open source community is not exactly aligned with your company, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about here. So if you paid those two charges, then we can get started. So I'm going to talk about the journey from forks to sporks, which is a journey I've taken. The journey of creating OpenSearch, that's really the heart of this one. But I'm actually going to go back well before OpenSearch as well. And to start the story, we got to go back to Elastic. And some folks here would be very familiar with the journey of Elasticsearch and its many relicensing choices over the years. And I, maybe tongue-in-cheek a little bit, a fork that shook the open source. Well, it at least rocked our little part of the world, however small that might be. But we'll start with that. Maybe I'm unique here, that I've had a perspective and an experience that's a little bit different from most folks, having been behind the doors at Elastic and then moving behind the doors at AWS. And I have the scar tissue to show for it, and legal letters and all sorts of fun drama that went with that. But let's start at that beginning. I left about 14 years of government work to go into the open source community after developing a spatial index for a project that everybody is very familiar with, MongoDB. And that was sort of the tipping point to say, man, I really want to get into this open source community. I developed a spatial index really it was designed for government purposes, and I had all intents and purposes to open it wide up and just hand it over to MongoDB for deployment within a very large intelligence community application within the Five Eyes network, so allies and all that. And I got the not invented here stiff arm, of course, from Elliot and then that time CEO. Well, you're not a MongoDB employee. You didn't write this. We'll get back to you, right? And I was like, wow, hey, wait a minute. That's not open source. That's not community. Now, mind you, this is about maybe 10 years into my career removed from academia. So probably a little bit naive for me in that. But I was recruited to go to Elastic and said, hey, you know what? Everything that you were doing over there, we really need you to fix Geo and Lucene. And so that was what I was chartered to do. I joined Elastic really early on, and I built with some folks over there, longtime Lucene committers, Mike McCandless, a few others, the BKD data structure became the foundation for numerics, and then I built all the Geo on top of that so we could get away from a weird text-based search engine for non-text-based data. And I loved it for those first few years because we were going to Elasticons, we were hearing from community about different unique ways that it was being used to analyze Sidney Crosby's slap shot. And oh, by the way, the Chicago Cubs baseball, my US side here, used it for the World Series. And so it was this, hey, let's keep doing the OSS, and I was getting really charged and everything, but hang on, there's a tipping point. There's a company that needs to make money. And so there was a tipping point that came back that said, yeah, maybe open source is not so good for our business interests much anymore. And this happened well before anything got out. Of course, very astute folks here could probably smell it in the air before it even happened. So I actually made the choice to jump ship, and again, just excited to go work on some different technology. I reached out to an old friend who had moved to Amazon actually 3 years prior to that and said, hey, I might want to work on product search, and I want to do more Lucene. I quickly got pulled into ODFE, and Yeah, that was kind of interesting. So only person there that had gone from years at Elasticsearch and moved to now AWS. And the first thing that I said was, get the heck out of court and just fork it. Like, just fork it. You can't blame the company for wanting to make money. And let's be real, you're probably not doing the best practices and behaviors here. And I got that. Don't say the F word. No, we don't want to do that. A fork, Elasticsearch, and rebrand. Nah, I think we'll keep open washing. Okay, so maybe this word has been said a couple times here, but open washing, for those that don't know, it's not the act of leaving your clothes out in the rain, which is what I thought when I first heard it. It's the definition by Michelle Thorne, who here in Berlin, right, when she was at the Mozilla Foundation, or Mozilla, right? Practice of using language and branding of open source to create an appearance, right? While gatekeeping. Those are really the key words out of that sort of long sentence there. So let's take a look. And this is why I say leave your biases behind, leave your company loyalty behind. And I think most people are good at doing that. Let's have a real honest conversation here. Let's take a look at the AWS's history of open washing. I mean, it goes back to 2009. If anybody did anything with MySQL and MariaDB, RDS came out. Let's capitalize on that. Well, Postgres, man, that's making a lot of headway. Let's go with Aurora. OpenJDK, nah, we got our own hardware. Let's fork it and create Corretto. There you go. There's a fork. KVM and Zen, let's fork it and create Firecracker. Elasticsearch, we don't want to carry the burden of maintaining that. Let's open wash it. And MongoDB, let's create an API that's compliant so we can open wash their customers too. Now back to my story. I got a Slack message day of. Holy cow, dude. And of course, names and faces are changed to protect the innocent. Did you see the Elastic relicensing show? Now it's more use. Okay, so I'll move on from, if you know the show, it's a good one. If you don't, check it out. So now let's get into the actual fork. So I actually forked Elasticsearch well before. So when I was told, don't say the F word, I mean, come on. Open source developer knows the ins and outs of that code. I forked it. I forked it immediately in preparation for something that could happen. And so the forking part is easy. Everybody knows how to use git commands. That's not hard. And of course, it's a very large code base. I think 2 million lines of code or something. And so I figured at some point we'd have a different name than Elasticsearch. Heck, there's trademark infringement happening. So you do a string replace, change Elasticsearch with rename me with a character in it, so you can do another string replace when you actually have a name, was done actually during some fun times of Texas where we had, they called it the 100-year freeze, and my power was going up and down and up and down, and it kept my laptop on long enough to go ahead and do that for a week. We actually had power up and down. So as you can imagine, the hard part is not that code. Everybody here could have done it, especially if you had 7 years or whatever at Elastic. The real challenges are what people said right off the bat. Well, what about governance? Hey, I'm very astutely familiar with AWS's behaviors here. So the PR, disaster management, I think Chris has some scar tissue that joined me on this. And so the real question, the governance, which the previous talk said it brilliantly. Like, governance is hard. Governance takes a long time. That's the number one question, though, is who really gets to say? And so I partnered up with a manager there at AWS, Charlotte. Maybe some of you know her. She's very much a longtime AWS manager. So she comes from muscle memory of AWS. I come from muscle memory of open source. Worlds collided immediately, in a good way, because when we have tension, we have innovation. And I feel like with Charlotte, we were able to have a lot of fights that created some innovation. Nevertheless, I actually got out of this talk because it was the pandemic and somebody caught COVID in a taxi cab. And I got the call and I was like, sorry, Charlotte, I had to show up late anyway, so maybe my timing just worked out for me. I felt really bad. I tried to support remote, but no, not at AWS. You got to be in the office to be able to give these presentations. So poor Charlotte had to shoulder this presentation alone. But here's what we fought over. Amazon's best practices from like, oh man, a 20-year employee maybe, versus open source best practices. The tension here is extremely real, and we were looking for a way to find some commonality and call it OpenSearch. Well, naturally, we have an impedance mismatch. One of the greatest things that AWS has is the leadership principles. Why? Because it creates a common nomenclature and vernacular for people to talk very efficiently. One of the worst things that AWS has is the leadership principles. Why? Because they are so broadly defined, you can use them and weaponize them any way that you want. And depending on who you talk to and what their motivations are, the politics and politicians come out like crazy. So let's look at the good, though, because look, I'm not going to bash AWS. Hey, they paid my check for a long time, and they created a good project that has really good intents, and those are intentions, right? So those of you at AWS, one of the greatest talks by, I don't think it was Bezos actually, but it's intentions versus mechanisms, right? You have intentions, and hopefully your mechanisms align with the intentions. Sometimes they don't. One of the biggest things that AWS does well, dang, they hire the best. Some of the greatest people I've ever worked with are at AWS, especially in the open source program office, by the way. Those individuals and those humans are brilliant. I learned a lot from them, and they really want to do the right thing. As I was trying to think of the good and the bad and the ugly, because that's really what this talk was about, I realized that for every good, there was, maybe bad's the wrong word, but not so good side of it. So if you're familiar with personality types, this would be their shadow personality. So AWS, they hire the best and they handcuff the best. They don't really give them an opportunity to stretch and do the innovation that they really can do. One of the good things that they do is ownership, which it means, and the definition is, if everybody owns something, nobody owns it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work so well in an open source community because you end up with silos and you end up with very strict governance with one owner that has one decision and one say. One of the greatest things they do is document-driven culture. Everything's written down. You write it down, you spend the first 10 minutes reading, and then you fight about it, right? One of the worst things that they do, especially in open source, is it's slow in practice. Now, what does that require? What does that end up with in the ugly? The Socratic method. Almost always, philosophical conversations are had at the sacrifice of real concrete development. That's at odds with an open source project that needs to move quick, especially for 0 to 1 startups that don't have the time to sit around and philosophize about why SPI may not be the good choice when it comes to security. And the result of that could be, and we're seeing a lot of it, community disengagement. So let's look at what that actually looks like in practice. And I screenshotted this a couple days ago. One of the greatest things we tried to do is, hey, let's open source the roadmap. Well, that's great. We're transparent. We're showing everything in the open. Now I'll come back to the title of that talk that we had at reInvent that I wasn't present for, called doing AWS OpenSearch work in the open. Notice it didn't really say open source work. It said doing OpenSearch work in the open. Okay, so visibly, meaning I'm behind glass and you can watch what I'm doing, but stay at your distance, right? Is really what that was at the time. And so I was pushing, again, Scar Tissue, along with Chris and a few others, let's try to get as much out in the open as possible. And I'm happy to say it's somewhat there, but then you actually dig into some of the numbers. There's 260 issues on the public roadmap. Those are meta issues, which is a overarching issue for multiple issues, RFCs, requests for changes, and proposals. Of those 260 issues, 4 are from the community, 1.5% ownership. Then we dive into those 4 from the community, and you see things like this. Community requests, they're less prioritized, I'm sorry. I'll kind of go through this. Hey, is your feature request related to a problem? Yes, I'm experiencing. Well, can you please share more details? There's the details, right? Yes, here's the mappings, da-da-da. This issue also is biting me, somebody else says, right? AWS, well, what's the main use case for those? That's a good question to ask. Well, my primary use case is this. My primary use case is this. All right, more conversations, by the way, for sake of brevity here. After doing some deep dive, we should probably wait on this. I'm also trying to do the same. Community chimes in. Is there any blocking this issue, right? Yes, there are blockers. Okay, still really excited to have the support. We're waiting. Okay, so that's a little bit about the roadmap and some of the consequences of a big company forking a project that's inherently an open source project. Now let's talk a little about the document-driven culture. Great in practice at a company, and then in open source. Man, it's credited to Mark Twain, but I'm going to credit it to me because I say it all the time. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter doc. These are screenshots from Firefox, because it allows you to do the whole scroll of just the RFC, just a handful of the RFCs that are in those 260. And I didn't have to go far. I just clicked a few, and oh, look at that one. Oh, there's another 6-pager that has turned into an open source issue. Is the community that's got to go 0 to 1 really fast going to read all that? Maybe. Maybe at nighttime when you need some slow reading and you're calming down. But this is a consequence of another good thing AWS does is bar raising. Raise a high bar so we have quality code. In the community, it's intimidating, verbose, hard to follow, and it misses and lacks lineage and history. And then it creates long cycle times. So I got curious at this, and I took a look at the cycle times by using Git's Graph API. We just took a look at, this is just OpenSearch core, which is the heart of all of OpenSearch, which is where I spent the most of my time. That's the true fork of Elasticsearch. All 121 other repositories are supporting, or their plugins, security, KNN, ML Commons, what have you. Now, I'm going to be fair here, right? So those blue dots are just the raw data. You'd expect with more engagement, cycle times, and maybe some long-running issues to take a lot longer. But the real key here is that orange graph. This is your 7-day moving average. The amount of time it's taking from an issue to open to close as the project becomes a little more top-heavy is taking longer and longer and longer. So if I trendline that, it's starting to approach an exponential curve. Not a good sign. The boiling frog, the frog is starting to boil. Then you see this kind of behavior, the hidden cost of AWS running an open source project. PR is getting rubber stamped. Service code starting to creep in. Take a look at ML Commons, and you will see Amazon Bedrock all over the place, right? Plugins tightly coupled to AWS services. S3 gets a priority. Azure doesn't. GCS doesn't. So if you're a customer or you're an open source contributor and you can't run on AWS, it might be kind of hard to find a plugin that allows you to do a repository tying to Google's cloud storage system. And then you have the PRs just getting closed and opened and closed and closed, and the community living over there like, hey, I'm actually getting back-channeled still, having left AWS for a while, and I don't know if there's much I can do. And of course, this proposal happens. It says, well, we really need, hey, and this is good, right? This is actually a key contributor who's on the committee. We need to separate our OSS functionality from vendor-specific one. I don't think I have the date on there, and I actually, again, I'm going to protect the innocent. You can find the issue if you'd like. Maybe you chime in on there and you offer up your suggestions on how to help the project move forward with this to identify all the AWS-specific things tidying in. So vendor-neutral software, or vibrant vendor-neutral software foundation was the objective. This was the last thing that I tried to push while I was there before I ended up venturing out on my own and to become a microcosm of a startup that's trying to do the same thing that a lot of people here are doing. But the number one question was, one of the things I was really trying to push was, hey, if this is going to be a cloud-based search system, maybe CNCF is a good approach. Right? Oh, actually, I'm missing something. So, or we could do a new sub-foundation. Right? We could actually create an open search software foundation. This was a couple of years ago that I brought up. I actually brought that up as a joke. Why don't we tell the community that their stuff is not good enough, so we just create our own foundation. It was original thought. But then you start digging into it, and one of the reasons I said, like, well, you could do this because there's many plugins that represent different communities. Geo, vectors, KNN, neural search, right? All these things. And the AWS culture really understood that because it translates well to what they know as pizza teams, which are very siloed teams working on very specific problems. Then you bring your own governance. Trademark protection is the driver for there because they need to protect a very large revenue stream. And trademarks matter. As Elastic has shown, imagine AWS, you got to rebrand the OpenSearch managed service to AWS's search as managed service. Doesn't have really as good of a ring to it. And then we create a technical steering committee, which I was a part, it's moved on, it was the leadership committee. I was a part of handpicking individuals, and one of the intentions there was to handpick 3 individuals from AWS out of 10, representing only 30% of that leadership committee. That didn't go over so well internally. That didn't go over so well internally, as you can imagine. Well, we need to make sure that we have a very high representation. So ultimately, I was actually trying to push Apache Software Foundation because being a Lucene committer, like maybe I'll let my bias kick in a little bit there, but at the core and the heart of it, it's Lucene, right? So my view was, let's try to bring OpenSearch to the Apache Software Foundation where Lucene lives and get those communities really talking to each other. Maybe not great because you get so many biases, so maybe the end result of bringing it to a Linux foundation or another foundation that has scar tissue as well, maybe that was the right choice. So let's look at the updated history of the open washing. Since then, we can add the Elasticsearch, OpenSearch, open washing as a fork, and then Redis and Valky took place. They forked it, and they're learning that forks maybe aren't so bad. So we can say the F word, I think. So what can startups do, right? I'm a microcosm of this, in full disclosure. I'm starting my own company too. We're one to a couple at this point, but if you had asked me 10 years ago, create an open source company, heck yeah, I'm open sourcing everything. Ask the me now that went through the scar tissue, and I'm pausing, which stinks because I have a lot that I would love to do on the OpenSearch project. And so there's some choices: open core versus our open foundation. These are two different things. Open core is around the software, open foundation is around the software and the governance. Is Apache Software Foundation's model the right thing? Look at DataStax and Cassandra. They do a soft fork, right? So we talk about these, open source is not a business model. Absolutely correct. Software development process, you can do a hard reset through a fork, or you can pick a hybrid model, much like DataStax did, which is really what we're leaning into. Spork the thing. And I don't know if you guys have sporks out here. I think you probably do. I actually had a hard time finding a picture of a spork, surprisingly enough. Business models, though: open core, public benefit companies, an open foundation where you bring the governance. And so I just bring this back, which is why I came here today. Hopefully it's starting a conversation. I actually wanted this to be a little bit spicy. I wanted to say some things that, maybe a little bit edgy against AWS. I love AWS. It's not going away. They manage all the hardware. Geez, I don't want to manage that. So they have a place, and they have really good people wanting to do good things. But is the open washing here to stay? Because they need to make money too, right? And they're just big, so maybe they're trying to compare the two revenue streams isn't a fair measuring stick. But I'll go back to the quote that we all have: OSS is like a free puppy, and I like free beer. So, closing thoughts, open discussion. Let's discuss. Let's talk what works, what doesn't. Competition is healthy. Yeah, it's true, but strip mining isn't. How do we create better business models for startups? How do we encourage startups to participate with open source communities? Most importantly, I think it starts with everybody here getting into the conversation and not sitting idly by. Just throw your hat in the ring, and I think we've got Beer 30 coming up to get raw with it. So happy to be here. Have the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, questions, questions. Do we have any questions?
So I think that the sharing about the scar tissues is very good because we tend to think, oh, let's do everything open source and that's going to be fine. But then the real world comes and hits it in the face. And then you started talking about the open source business models, and then something came to mind that is, I never seen something like a time-bound license. Let's say, okay, I'm going to start developing, and for 1 year, the things that I am developing are proprietary, and after this much time, it goes back into the community or something like that. Yeah. Just as an idea, have you ever seen something like that into the direction of a business model?
So in practice, I personally have not seen it. It's funny you mention that because I actually just recently have had somebody else talk about this too. Probably there's other folks here who have put that in practice. But yes, short answer to this would be yes. I've heard now on some of the dual licensing approaches is that you could do time-bound, which will put a expiration on this, giving an opportunity to bootstrap and go forward. And it's something that's a very is an interest for us personally. But I was talking to some other folks here too about, is licensing the only protection mechanism? Maybe it is. I don't know. It's something I'm certainly interested in. I have not seen it in practice, so maybe somebody else here could add to that conversation. But yeah, good point.
I just wanted to add to that suggestion, because I think software is much more fluid than, for instance, publishing. So in the publishing business, you do have this model. You'll publish something, it's copyrighted for, let's say, half a year or a year, and then it gets open access. But as the way, at least I understand, code, it's very fluid, and even if it is intended to be open source, it needs to be more fluid, because if not, I mean, you can't freeze it for half a year or a year. So I wonder if the Wikipedia model would be a solution, you know, saying, okay, I really like what you're doing, and therefore I donate stuff regularly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting thought. I will say one of the things during the fork process that I was really diligent about, and I kind of joked about this earlier, but the legal letters were very real. And because of the legal letters, because I've touched, I think, every aspect of XPack while I was there, and so naturally Elastic had some concerns. But because of that, I will say that the most important for me personally in doing the fork was retaining the Git history and the Git log for traceability back to every change. And so I think what you guys are proposing is a really interesting concept. Take that model of as the changes are going for the year that you're proprietary, as long as you open it back, once you open it back up, you have that trace log back, then everybody can see the evolution of it. I think maybe that touches on the most important thing, trust, right? Because it's weird to open source something with a issue or a pull request 0, right? And no history before that. And I think it's unfair, especially for people who you might have forked from. So it's a really interesting thought, yeah.
Oh, it's not even a question. You want a picture of a Spork? It's on Mastodon already. If you hashtag OpenSearch or something else.
I love you guys.
The Dutch.
Yes, that's fantastic.
Amazing.
Yes. This is why I love the community.